In 1894, the U.S. Congress each passed, the Senate and House each passed resolutions politically to render President Cleveland a lame duck, basically politically pressuring the president not to restore the government. According to U.S. constitutional law, resolutions of Congress passed regarding concrete executive matters as an encroachment. It's an encroachment on the executive function of the president in foreign relations. So it has no legal effect. But what it did was it prevented the president from carrying out his responsibilities. If anything, what the Congress does provide with executive agreements is not whether it's valid or not, but normally Congress is requested to appropriate monies to fulfill executive agreements. And this is where the Senate and House were holding back and preventing the president from doing anything with Hawaii. Now basically what that did was it put Hawaii into civil unrest. And these insurgents renamed themselves the Republic of Hawaii. Now, these people still have not been granted amnesty. The Queen was not restored and the executive power was not returned. So the Republic of Hawaii says they exist. They're trying to portray themselves as a government. And what they wanted to do is to wait for another president to come into office to see if they can transfer all of Hawaii to the United States the second time. The first time was under President Harrison. And that was when a treaty of cession was signed February 14th, 1893. Well, because of the investigation by Grover Cleveland, he never resubmitted that treaty to the Senate, so that treaty was dead. A second attempt to transfer Hawaii took place again on June 16th, 1897. And that was when President McKinley came into office. And President McKinley is not adhering to the executive agreements, whereby reliance was made clearly under the protest by the Queen and Hawaiian subjects, knowing that the executive agreement existed. So that treaty was signed on June 16th, and the Queen was in Washington, D.C. at that time. And she filed a diplomatic protest with the U.S. State Department, reminding them of the executive agreements and that what they're doing is they are making an agreement with insurgents, and that she urged the president to not submit it to the U.S. Senate. Well, the president disregarded the protest and was intent on submitting the treaty to the Senate, but the Senate would not convene until December of 1897. That is what activated the Hawaiian Patriotic League and the Hui Kalai'aina, two Hawaiian political organizations in Hawaii, for signature petitions. The Hui Alohaina, the Hawaiian Patriotic League, gathered 21,269 signatures protesting annexation. And the Hui Kalai'aina was able to gather over 17,000 signatures. The Hui Alohaina signature petition was the one decided to be submitted to the U.S. Senate when it convened in December. And they met with Senator Hoare from Massachusetts, and the people who signed these protests were multinational as well as multi-ethnic. You had Hawaiian subjects that were not necessarily native or aboriginal, but you also had American citizens and foreign citizens who were residing in the kingdom who also signed that protest because of the legal issues. Well, Senator Hoare from Massachusetts read it into the Senate minutes and put it on the record in December of 1897. The Senate could not ratify that treaty. By March, the treaty's dead. All you still have are the executive agreements that are not being adhered to. Now, that's March of 1898. War is going to break out between the Spanish and the United States on April 21st, just 1 month later. And the United States is going to have to fight the Spanish in both Guam and the Philippines, as well as Puerto Rico and Cuba. This is where Hawaii and the chance for Congress to act on. Well, Admiral Dewey of the U.S. Pacific Fleet defeated the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898. 3 days later, May 4th, Representative Francis Newlands from Nevada introduces a resolution for the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. That resolution was submitted to the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, voted out, placed on the floor of the House for a vote, and in the debates that are going on, that is in the congressional records, which is a part of my research, representatives were clearly saying that the United States cannot pass a law annexing a foreign state because U.S. laws have no force and effect beyond the borders of the United States. Nevertheless, they passed the law because they were at war. They wanted to show their support for the president and moved to the Senate. Senator White from California specifically made reference of this so-called joint resolution purporting to be a cession. And he said this is not a cession. A cession is made between two countries. It is not by agreement between the House and Senate. Well, again, everybody's supporting the president, so they voted for it. And the president signs the joint resolution of annexation into law, federal law, July of 1898. Now, a joint resolution of annexation has no force and effect beyond the borders of the United States. There is countless case law on this. The United States Congress could no more annex a foreign country by passing a law than it can pass a resolution tomorrow annexing Afghanistan. Laws do not extend beyond the borders of the United States. Now, what has happened since then is where the deception took place, and there is clear evidence that they were hiding this joint resolution and purporting as if Hawaii was annexed by a treaty. And there's clear evidence in State Department records, as well as the Department of Education, the Territory of Hawaii, namely W.D. Alexander, who was a professor, who was the author of the history book that was used in the territorial days. It's all manufactured. There's no treaty. It's a joint resolution of annexation. It has no force and effect. Now, 2 years later, in 1900, the United States Congress passes another law called an Act to Provide for the Government of the Territory of Hawaii. Again, notwithstanding territorial limits of law, territorial government was instituted here in the Hawaiian Islands in violation of the executive agreement. And President McKinley appointed as the first governor of the Territory of Hawaii, Sanford Dole, who was the lead insurgent that has not received amnesty pursuant to the executive agreement because the government wasn't restored. Then in 1950, a bill was introduced in Congress transforming the Territory of Hawaii into the state of Hawaii. And it went through the process of a plebiscite and other issues that needed to take place. And in 1959, President Eisenhower signed that law, transforming the territory into a state. The problem we have is the state of Hawaii, which is a congressional law that created it, is still limited to U.S. territory. But it's also a direct violation of the executive agreements under the Supremacy Clause. Both cannot exist at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. So because the executive agreement continues to exist, despite the violations that have taken place, the continuity of the Hawaiian Kingdom is by virtue of those executive agreements that have not been carried out. And that responsibility falls upon the President of the United States.
If the Kingdom of Hawaii continues to exist, despite the fact that its government has been overthrown, how does that apply now to this question of subject matter jurisdiction?
That's a good point.
Objection, Your Honor. Ultimate question on the subject matter is not qualified to testify.
Well, we're not telling the judge, this is his final decision, but in terms of his the doctor's dissertation, there was a specific section on subject matter. He's giving his opinion, but of course the court always makes the final determination.
Okay, okay, Your Honor, record objection, he wasn't qualified for that basis.
Proceed.
Okay. Well, again, when we're talking about the President's authority in foreign relations, he's represented by the U.S. military and diplomats. For myself, I'm a former captain in the Army. I used to be a field artillery officer. We're trained in the Hague and Geneva Conventions because we do a lot of training in foreign countries. What basically takes place is that the President, being represented in foreign countries by the military or diplomat, it's the military that has to enforce the laws of an occupied state. That's the mandate of Article 43 of the Hague Convention. That's precisely what happened after the overthrow of the Iraqi government at war, where the United States military established, headed by a military governor, the Coalition Provisional Authority. The Coalition Provisional Authority's military governor was then replaced by Ambassador Bremer, both representing the President in foreign relations. The Coalition Provisional Authority was administering Iraqi law. They were not administering United States law because Iraq continued to exist as a state. Its sovereignty was still intact. It's just it didn't have a government to administer. So what should have happened was basically what should have happened even during the Spanish-American War. When Admiral Dewey defeated the Spanish in Manila Bay and began the occupation of Guam and the Philippines, he established a military government to administer Spanish law. And that Spanish law was replaced by U.S. law when the Treaty of Peace was signed in December of 1898. Okay? Before that, the military had to administer Spanish law. The military, in administering the laws of the occupied state, exercises legislative, executive, and judicial functions.